Do tenants trash properties? Hey, I'm Hussain, also known as the Property Joint Venture Expert and your partner for wealth creation through property. So in this video, I just want to talk about the idea of properties getting trashed by tenants. So I've been in this business nearly 14 years now. I also own a letting agency, a very specialist niche one. It's doing HMOs for professional tenants in Birmingham. So during that time, probably I've had one property that's been badly trashed by tenants. I've had my fair share of problems with furniture being nicked, a few things being broken and issues like that. But hey, that can be expected with the time I've been in the business and also the number of properties I've been involved in during that time. But here's the thing, the idea that tenants trash properties and you shouldn't get into property or be a property investor because of all these issues and challenges, the reality is it happens very, very frequently. Very small percentage of properties have we had those kind of issues with. But there's a number of things you can do to reduce the chances of that happening. And then what can you do to protect yourself after the event as well? So let's talk about some of those things. So first and foremost is before you move a tenant into the property, you need to make sure you're doing your due diligence then. So for example, at our agency, we don't use external referencing companies. We do all the work in-house. Some people think that's a lot of work to do, but we want to be sure we're moving the right type of people into our properties. My personal view is I'd rather have a property sitting empty that little bit longer just to ensure we get the right people in, rather than moving the first person that comes along that can afford to move in, which unfortunately is what some landlords or agents might do. What this does enables us just to manage that process. I've got a friend of mine, we don't do this by the way, but it's a great tip for you. I've got a friend of mine that actually goes and visits the tenants in their home, in their current home, before they move, just to get a feel for and a sense for how they live. Because the reality is when a tenant's making an application for a property, be it with an agent or be it with a landlord directly, that's the best version of them. That's going to be the best representation of that tenant. Now, if you kind of sense that this is not the kind of person you like in how they are, their behavior, whatever it might be, then it's only going to get worse. It's not necessarily going to get any better. They're going to present themselves in the best way. Just like when you're going for a job interview, you're going to be presenting yourself in the best possible light. It's exactly the same thing when tenants make an application for a property to take you on and become a potential tenant with you. So the referencing is really important. The other thing you can also do is, unfortunately now we can no longer take larger deposits as the rules have changed. Previously we used to take larger deposits just as a little bit of a backup. But the other good thing you can do that will really help you to protect you is make sure you've got a good guarantor. Now, what's a guarantor? A guarantor is somebody that will actually co-sign the agreement, will actually have a separate document that they sign to say, look, if the tenant is an issue in terms of them paying or being compliant in terms of their responsibilities, then the guarantor will step in and be able to help you deal with that. Ultimately, it's about if the tenant doesn't pay, you can talk to the guarantor and say, hey, you need to pay up because the tenant now is not paying or there's an issue there. Or if the tenant leaves and causes damage, as we're talking about in this video, and then you can pursue the guarantor, try and get some money from them to cover those costs, even if your tenant does a runner and disappears on you, which happens occasionally, very rarely. It does depend on what market you're in as well, because there's various different types of tenants that you'll come across. So with the guarantor, it's important for us, especially when we're looking at guarantor, that we're looking at two key factors. One, we're looking at their ability to be able to afford to cover this cost should a problem arise. So what I mean by that is that the guarantor needs to have a healthy income, not only to be able to pay their own outgoings each month, but if they need to, they can service and be able to pay or contribute towards any shortfall that our tenant might be doing. So it's important that the guarantor can actually do that. There's no point signing up dear old Aunt Flo, who's on her pension, gets a pension credit of 50 quid a week or whatever it is, signing up as a guarantor, because Aunt Flo's not going to be able to pay if the tenant can't pay either. So it's important that your guarantor is in a position to pay. The other thing we look for in guarantors, again something that we choose to do, is to ensure that they're a homeowner, because there's less likely chances of that guarantor disappearing on us as well. If they own a property, it just means mostly they're better of financial standing, means we've got something there to be able to pursue, and they're going to have some pain if they're not paying the property, so it can cause some financial pain, if that makes sense. Now, the other thing is, once the, let's say the tenant moves out and they cause some damage, You should have taken a deposit at the beginning, as I was talking about. Deposits are now limited to 5 weeks, and 5 weeks isn't a huge amount of money. If someone causes damage, that 5 weeks is not going to cover very much. Often, if you've got a problematic tenant, they might not even pay the last month's rent and disappear. So those 5 weeks are barely going to cover the cost of that, not really cover any damages. This is where a guarantor helps. Now, what we tend to do if we have an issue like that, a tenant disappears owing rent, what we tend to do is park that for the moment, and we give it a few months, and then we use a service to trace tenants. There's many tenant tracing services or people tracing services that you can use, because often what happens is the person moves, they go somewhere, they settle down, they move their bank accounts, they register for council tax, their credit cards get changed over, etc., etc. As these things happen, they start leaving a footprint in terms of their new address. Now, if I start trying to trace them immediately as soon as they've left, it's not actually going to show up anywhere, so I'm not going to be able to find them. So what the tracing agencies do, especially if you go in a few months' time, you'll find that often they'll be able to find where they've moved to. Once you've found where they've moved to, then what we would do is we'd write to them and tell them they still owe us this money. Usually they're a bit surprised to know what actually we found, or even remembered that they owe this money. Then we'd write to them, ask them for the money. If we're not getting anywhere, we'd make a claim online using the money claim online. I was trying to remember the name then, which is an online court service for small amounts of money that you can recover that way. You've got a little court fee to pay, and generally what we find is it doesn't get challenged because we've got proof anyway that they do owe us the money. If it doesn't get challenged, what happens by default, we end up with a CCJ, or they end up with a CCJ, which we can then go and try and enforce through a debt collection agency or bailiffs as well. Now, some of these things will help in terms of putting pressure on the tenant or a guarantor to be able to recover this money. Just before we finish off, the other thing I want to mention is if you're doing credit checks on your tenant and you find that the tenant is financially quite sound, often you can take out insurance to protect you against these situations as well. There's many different insurance products out there that you can explore looking at to give you some kind of cover on your tenants in case the tenants do a bump, cause damage. You can use those schemes as well. And also there's some rent deposits or insurance schemes available as well, which is a little bit different, but there's levels of protection you can have. Ultimately, there's many things you can insure against, but the more things you insure against, all these things are eating into your rent each month and reducing your profit. So it's about deciding what's a comfort level for you in terms of putting tenants in property. So just to summarize, if you've got tenants that are potentially going to trash a property or have already trashed and left, you can search to see where they've moved to, chase them through the courts there. If you've got a guarantor, you can pursue them that way. Or at the beginning, just be very careful in terms of who you put in the properties. Make sure you're taking a deposit. You can consider an insurance policy as well, and make sure you've got a guarantor. These are things that will reduce your chances of your kitchen sink getting nicked. So I hope you found this video useful. Let me know if you've ever had any problems, or if you know somebody that has problems with properties and properties getting trashed. Love to get your comments, and I'll share my thoughts with you as well. I look forward to seeing you again on the next video.